The scariest thing that ever happened to me on Halloween took place when I was living in Newcastle during university. Halloween is always a huge night for students, just like any event that involves dressing up and drinking too much. But since Halloween is also an excuse to wear a lot less than usual, party-loving students get especially excited about it. I was in my second year, living with a few friends in a house just off Kinley Avenue, an area where students could rent shared houses for really cheap. We heard about a big house party happening just down the road, one of those with a Facebook event page for invites and directions. I remember my friends sitting around the kitchen table, checking out the profiles of all the girls who were attending. Some of them were really attractive, so naturally we were excited. Just a few days before Halloween, I started feeling awful. I had the chills, was running to the bathroom every half hour, and couldn't keep any food down. This went on for about 2 days, and luckily by Halloween it had eased up. But I still felt too rough to join in on any serious partying. The last thing I wanted was to embarrass myself in front of all the girls at the party. Every guy wants to be remembered for the right reasons, right? On the day of the party, my friends kept trying to get me to come along and throw together a quick costume, but I decided to stay home and relax. Even though I felt like I was missing out, I just didn't have the energy. Around 7 p.m., while my friends were drinking in the kitchen, I was upstairs trying to order the spiciest curry I could find, hoping it would help clear the rest of the sickness out of me. While I was eating my fiery chicken curry, my friends were about to head out for the party. They made a few last attempts to get me to join, but after that curry, there was no chance. I was ready to collapse into a food coma. A couple of hours later, I was lounging on the couch, annoyed by how bad the British Netflix horror selection was, when I heard a knock at the front door. At first, I thought maybe one of my friends had come back to change clothes after drinking too much at the party. Since the party was only down the street, it wasn't impossible. Then it hit me it could be trick-or-treaters. Kinley Avenue had a mix of family homes and student houses, so kids sometimes came by looking for sweets. To avoid getting the house egged, I quickly grabbed a few chocolate bars from the kitchen cupboard. But when I opened the door, no one was there. Maybe I took too long, or maybe it was just kids playing a prank. But either way, the porch was empty. I shrugged it off, went back inside, and settled back on the couch. A little later, while watching Netflix and feeling drowsy, something caught my eye in the corner of the room. You know when you're so used to a place that even the smallest change stands out? I noticed that less of the orange glow from the streetlights was coming through the curtains. It was like a shadow was blocking the light. I sat up, nervous, and the shadow quickly disappeared, letting the light back in. Someone had been watching me. I grabbed my housemate's cricket bat from under the stairs and cautiously moved toward the door, ready to swing at anyone outside. But again, there was no one there. I started to think maybe I was losing it. I hadn't been sleeping well the past few nights because of the illness, and I told myself that maybe I was just overtired. I decided to call it a night and head to bed early. I did some washing up, took a shower, and changed into comfortable clothes. But just as I was about to get into bed, I heard another knock at the door, this time followed by a faint voice saying, "Trick or treat." I nearly jumped, but the voice was kind of reassuring. It had to be just some kids, right? I grabbed the chocolates I'd set aside earlier and opened the door. To my surprise, there was only one person standing on the path. They looked like a teenager, a bit old for trick-or-treating, but not particularly intimidating. What freaked me out was the mask they were wearing. It looked really old and creepy, like it hadn't been washed in years. I couldn't even tell if it was meant to be a Halloween mask. It looked like an old man's face with tiny black eyes and a big, unsettling grin. I made a comment like, "Aren't you a bit old for this?" and held out the chocolates. I expected him to grab them and run off, but he just stood there, staring at me from behind the mask, not saying a word. I asked if he was okay, starting to feel really creeped out by the silence. But still, he didn't respond. The longer we stood there, the more anxious I got. Just as I was about to awkwardly close the door, I heard a loud crash from the kitchen. Without thinking, I ran toward the noise and saw the back door being smashed open. Several people in masks rushed into the kitchen, some with bats, others with knives. Panicking, I turned and sprinted back toward the front door, hoping to get upstairs to call the police. But blocking the stairs was the masked teenager from the door, now holding a knife. He had been in on it the whole time. As he pointed the knife at me, I raised my hands in a "please don't hurt me" gesture. "Get on the floor," he said, his voice sounding no older than 14. That scared me even more. I lay face down on the hallway floor, hands on the back of my head, trembling as the group ransacked the house. They took everything: phones, laptops, game consoles, even our clothes. They smashed things for fun and taunted me, kicking me as they passed by. It felt like an eternity before they finally left, but not before one of them held a knife to my throat, threatening to come back and kill me if I called the police. When they were gone, I stayed on the floor for a long time, too shaken to move. Eventually, I got up and looked around at the mess. They'd taken almost everything of value. I wanted to call the police, but with what phone? All I could do was wait for my housemates to come home, feeling utterly defeated. It was the worst night of my life. The police couldn't do much except take a report, and we never got our stuff back. For a long time, I blamed myself for not protecting the house, but therapy helped me understand that it wasn't my fault. Even though I've moved past it, that night still haunts me. It's by far the most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me. My mom tied the knot with her boyfriend from a few years back, about 5 years ago now. It wasn't one of those awkward situations, though. I was genuinely happy for her. My dad had passed away from brain cancer when I was just 12, so she had been on her own for over 12 years, and I knew how much she missed having someone in her life. Her new relationship with this guy had been a whirlwind for a while, with them meeting, dating, breaking up, then dating again before finally getting married. Mom sometimes felt guilty, like she was betraying my dad's memory, which made things hard for her new boyfriend. But he stuck around, even when things were tough for her, and I have to admit, that's when I realized how much he truly cared for her. She once mentioned that he had also gone through some losses in his life, which gave them something in common to bond over. Like I said, I liked him. I didn't know much about his background, but seeing my mom happy was enough for me to support the relationship. After they got married, she moved into his large, old house up in northern England. He had made quite a bit of money through the stock market and even offered to pay the rent for the apartment my mom and I used to share, which I definitely didn't mind. My boyfriend moved in with me when she left, and it worked out perfectly. A few months later, we were invited to visit them. I thought maybe we could all get together for Christmas, but it turned out they were heading to the Maldives for the winter. They wouldn't be back until February, so we juggled our schedules and found a few days at the end of October to meet up. The days leading up to Halloween, actually. My mom's new house was quite remote, really out of the way. It took 3 train rides and a very expensive taxi to reach, but when we finally arrived, it was worth the trouble. The place was absolutely stunning, like something from a period drama. The estate, as her husband called it, spanned hundreds of acres of rolling hills and was one of the most beautiful places I had ever seen. I was a bit nervous about getting to know Simon, my mom's new husband, but I was committed to making an effort. I knew how much it meant to her, and I'd do anything to see her happy. Besides, it was my first real break in years, and I was determined to enjoy it. Simon was a perfect gentleman. He made me and my boyfriend feel very welcome and showed us how well he treated my mom. He didn't try to be my stepdad or anything, just the right amount of respectful distance, and for that, I was grateful. But something felt off that first day. As much as Simon tried to make us comfortable, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. I couldn't quite figure out what it was. but it bothered me more as the day went on. My boyfriend suggested that maybe staying in such a huge, old house on Halloween was playing tricks on me, but I'm a fan of horror movies and I'm not easily spooked. Still, something felt wrong. I chalked it up to being more upset about my mom's remarriage than I had admitted to myself. So, I kept making an effort, wandering around the estate's grounds with my boyfriend, because being inside the house only made me feel worse. I didn't want my mom thinking I had any issues with Simon or, heaven forbid, that I was jealous of his wealth. That wasn't it at all. That evening, my boyfriend and I decided to relax with a bath in the guest room's luxurious tub. As we chatted, he suddenly stopped and asked me about a bruise on my back. I had no idea what he was talking about, but when I felt my shoulder, there was indeed a massive bruise there. Even though I hadn't hurt myself, I brushed it off, thinking maybe it came from carrying our luggage, though I knew that wasn't likely. Still, I stayed quiet the rest of the night, feeling more uneasy than ever. That night, I barely slept. The guest room had a view of a large, empty field outside, and for some reason, it unsettled me. At one point, I got up and stared out the window into the darkness, not sure what I was looking for. I only managed to fall asleep after struggling to close the heavy, old curtains with my boyfriend's help. I hoped I'd feel better the next day, but when I woke up on Halloween morning, I was in tears. My boyfriend had to shake me awake, saying I'd been crying in my sleep. I didn't remember any bad dreams, but I knew something was wrong, and I told him we needed to leave. He tried to reassure me, thinking it was just the stress of seeing my mom with someone else, but I was adamant it wasn't that. Something was off about the house. He came up with an excuse about a family emergency, saying I needed to leave with him for support. Once we got in the taxi and left, I felt like a huge weight had lifted. I still felt strange for a few days, mostly because I knew my mom was still up there in that house, but I was relieved to be away. A few weeks later, when my mom and Simon were back in London, I told her I didn't like the house. I explained everything: the bruise, the uneasy feeling, waking up crying. She went pale and finally confessed that she had felt the same way. She had hoped spending time there as a family would make it better, but it didn't. It turns out Simon had lost his first wife under tragic circumstances. She had struggled with severe postpartum depression after the birth of their third child, and despite the doctor's efforts to help, one day she took her own life in the field outside the house, the same field visible from the guest room window. I grew up in a small farming town in Nebraska, the type of place where cornfields stretched as far as the eye could see. It wasn't the best place to be a kid, but it was home. Even though I have some fond memories, I always knew I wanted to leave. Halloween was my favorite time of year, but while kids in nearby towns like Lincoln or Omaha could go trick-or-treating in real neighborhoods and fill up bags of candy, we'd have to walk miles just to get to the next house. The only time we experienced what trick-or-treating was like for other kids was when our mom drove us to Hastings one year. Otherwise, it just wasn't an option for us. The last year we were allowed to go trick-or-treating, our closest neighbor, who lived about 3 miles away, told us we were too old for it. He usually gave us a few apples, but that year he sent us away empty-handed, and we were furious. We spent the whole year glaring at his house every time we passed it, holding a grudge because he ruined our favorite part of Halloween. We were just kids, but kids can be stubborn and cruel, and we were no different. The next Halloween, our mom decided to take us to a place called Pioneer Village near Grand Island. It's an outdoor museum that shows what life was like for early settlers in the Midwest. As you can imagine, 2 boys in their early teens weren't exactly thrilled about it. Learning about the history of Halloween was kind of interesting, though. I especially liked hearing about how people believed spirits returned on Halloween night to seek revenge on those who wronged them. But what really grabbed our attention was when they talked about how kids in the old days would play pranks on their neighbors. They'd pull up vegetables from gardens, push wagons into the streets, or take down barnyard gates and leave them in other people's yards. My brother and I exchanged a glance, silently agreeing that our neighbor was going to get it this year. So that Halloween, we snuck out in the early morning with a hammer and screwdriver, walked to our neighbor's house, and took his front gate off its hinges. We carried it a mile down the road and left it in another neighbor's yard. Over the next few years, we upped our game, pulling bigger pranks on him each time. One year, we dismantled part of his white picket fence and threw it into the cornfield across the road. We never stayed to see his reaction, but imagining him finding the mess in the morning was enough to make us laugh. Then one year, we went to his house at night and saw something we never expected. The neighbor, who always hated Halloween, had put up a Grim Reaper figure on his porch. It wasn't a flimsy scarecrow either. It looked like a real mannequin, dressed in a black robe, complete with a rusty scythe leaning next to it. He must have gone all out to scare us off. But we weren't deterred. We were determined to pull off our prank, just like every other year. As we quietly started taking apart his fence, I noticed something strange. The Grim Reaper figure wasn't where it had been. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but when I told my brother, he got spooked too. We crouched down, realizing we might have been a little too cocky this time. "Let's get out of here," my brother whispered, and we started heading back toward the road. Then, out of nowhere, the Grim Reaper appeared, standing in our path, scythe in hand. That's when it hit us. It wasn't a statue. It was our neighbor, dressed up and waiting for us. There was a tense moment where we locked eyes. Then we bolted. But since he was blocking the road, we had to run back through his yard, climbing over a fence into a cornfield. He was fast for an older guy, probably fueled by years of pent-up anger. Despite his robes and the scythe, he chased us with surprising speed. I thought we'd outrun him, but when I jumped over the fence, I landed wrong and badly twisted my ankle. That's when the fear really set in. I couldn't run, and my brother had already taken off. I wanted to call out for help but didn't dare make a sound, knowing the neighbor would find me. So there I was, hiding in the cornfield, trying not to breathe too loudly, while the guy stalked up and down the rows, looking for me. Every so often, I'd limp a little further away, doing my best not to rustle the corn. Thankfully, it was pitch dark, and he didn't seem to have great eyesight. Eventually, he gave up and headed back to his house, but not before shouting threats like, "I'll chop you up and feed you to my pigs." The worst part was that he sounded like he really meant it. I was terrified, barely able to move fast enough to get away. After that, we didn't mess with him again. I made up a story to my parents about how I hurt my ankle and stayed home until it healed. I was paranoid for weeks, worried he'd figure out we were the ones behind all the pranks. That's my story. It might not be the scariest thing you've ever heard, but we definitely got what we deserved in the end. My family has lived in a quiet, rural part of the Midwest ever since they moved here from a region in Eastern Europe, what is now the Czech Republic, in the mid-1800s. They belonged to a little-known Christian group that was severely persecuted in their homeland. Fleeing this oppression, they sailed to America, arriving at Ellis Island. They lived in New York City for a time before being forced out and eventually settling in the countryside. There, they started farming, working the land, and became quite prosperous, though they remained isolated from others. According to a family story, which my granddad swears is true, it was late October when my great-great-grandmother fell ill with a terrible sickness. The family did everything they could to keep her comfortable, riding for miles on horseback to get medicine that revived her a few times. However, just as they thought she might recover, her condition suddenly worsened, and she passed away one night just after midnight. This would have been a sad event in any case, but the timing was especially significant to my family. She died just after midnight on October 31st, Halloween. My family, being part of a unique sect of Eastern European Christians, believed Halloween to be a time when the spirits of the dead were particularly active. They held that if someone died on this night, spirits could inhabit the body of the recently deceased, resurrecting it for evil purposes. To prevent this, they had to perform specific rituals quickly and bury the body as soon as possible to stop any malevolent spirits from taking control. According to my grandfather, after my great-great-grandmother's passing, they washed her body with special oils, burned sage to ward off spirits, and buried her in the family cemetery located on a remote part of their land. My great-great-grandmother had 2 large dogs who adored her, and when she passed, they were heartbroken. They stayed by her body for hours and, after she was buried, refused to leave her grave. Despite the family trying to coax them back with food, the dogs stayed by the gravesite, only eating and drinking when food was brought to them. About a week and a half after the burial, well into November, the dogs began barking and scratching at the earth over the grave. They howled all night and tried to dig into the ground, so much so that one of my long-dead uncles had to drag them back to the house to stop them from digging up the grave. Even when locked inside, they continued to bark and howl in the direction of the cemetery, causing the family a lot of distress. The grief was already unbearable, and the dog's strange behavior made it worse. Eventually, the family decided to check the grave to make sure everything was in order, suspecting that rats might have gotten into the coffin. After hours of digging through the hard soil, they uncovered the casket and found it undamaged, with no sign of rodents. However, the dogs continued barking, directing their howls into the open grave. The family, worried something was wrong, decided to exhume the body to ensure nothing was out of place. What they found was horrifying. Instead of the peaceful expression my great-great-grandmother had when they buried her, her eyes were wide open in terror, and her jaw hung open in a silent scream. Patches of her gray hair were missing, torn out by her own hands, which lay in clumps around her head. Her fingers were bloodied and broken, her fingernails scattered inside the coffin, and deep scratches marked the inside of the coffin lid, showing her desperate attempts to claw her way out. The sight drove her husband mad. He ran from the cemetery, screaming, and was never the same again. Realizing what had happened that Halloween night, he eventually hanged himself in the barn. It became clear to him, despite their lack of medical knowledge, that my great-great-grandmother had not been dead when they buried her. She had fallen into a coma that they mistook for death, and while unconscious, she was buried alive. The dogs had not been howling because they sensed rats, but because they heard my great-great-grandmother screaming for help, tearing at the coffin, and trying to escape her grave. The thought of her suffering drove them into a frenzy, and that's why they howled and barked every night. I don't know how true this story is, but I can't imagine why anyone in our family would make up something so horrible. Maybe it's told over and over again because my ancestors wanted to ensure that such a tragedy never happened again. The trauma was so great, nearly tearing the family apart. And even though they had survived persecution in both Europe and America, this event nearly destroyed them. To this day, our family elders share the story every year around Halloween with the older children, so they understand and never forget the horror that haunted our ancestors. I had a strange childhood growing up in Louisiana. My parents weren't really around much. Not that they were bad parents, they always made sure my sister and I had what we needed. But let's just say they weren't always paying attention, mostly because they were always caught up in their jobs. This meant I could do pretty much whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted to, which, as you might guess, wasn't the best for me. One of the things I did as a kid that probably wasn't great was staying up late watching TV until I passed out on the couch. I loved those nights, getting to see movies that none of my friends were allowed to watch. But staying up late like that once led to me witnessing something way more terrifying than any horror movie. It was Halloween night, and I was lying on the couch in the living room, drifting off after a fun evening of trick-or-treating with some friends from school. I was watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, my stomach aching from eating too much candy, when I suddenly heard a noise coming from the porch. It was an old porch swing creaking, that kind of unmistakable metal squeak you can picture right away. My mom and dad were upstairs, doing their usual secretive grown-up stuff. My sister was already in bed. As soon as I realized someone else was out on the porch, someone I didn't know, a chill ran down my spine. I was scared, but I couldn't help myself. I had to see who it was. Even at that age, I felt protective of my little sister. So, I tiptoed over to the big windows in the living room and peeked out from behind the curtains to see the porch. It was dark outside, and we didn't have any porch lights back then, so the only light came from the street lamps. At first, it was hard to make anything out, but after a few seconds, my eyes adjusted, and I saw her. Sitting on the porch swing was an older woman, maybe in her 50s or 60s. She was wearing a worn-out nightgown, her hair in curlers. In her hand, I saw something that took me a moment to recognize because it was covered in dark, dripping liquid. It wasn't until I saw the faint glint of the blade that I realized it was a knife, and the liquid was blood. When I understood what I was looking at, I panicked. I ran upstairs to my parents' room, where they were doing their usual thing, hiding whatever it was they didn't want me to see. They were annoyed, asking me what was wrong and why I was barging in. Normally, I would have said something like I needed food or couldn't sleep, but this time, I was too terrified to get the words out. At first, they brushed me off, saying it was just a bad dream from the movies I watched or too much candy. But I kept crying, insisting it was real and begging them to check. My dad got fed up and dragged me downstairs, more to prove a point than anything, telling me there was nothing outside. As he yanked me towards the front door, I was terrified because I knew what I had seen. He swung the door open, and at first, he didn't even look, just pointed outside and said, "See? Nothing there." But then he saw her, the woman sitting on the porch swing holding the bloody knife. I've never seen my dad look like that again. Pure shock and fear took over his face. I finally got a good look at her, too. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, her eyes wide and hollow, like there was nothing behind them. She stood up, holding the knife, and said words I'll never forget. "I killed him. I had to." My dad pulled me back inside so fast I nearly tripped. He slammed the door shut and ran upstairs to grab his gun. I peeked from the hallway as he went back outside and aimed the gun at her, telling her to leave or the police would be there soon. She didn't run. She just stood up slowly and wandered off into the night. Later, I found out the man she killed was her abusive husband. She couldn't take it anymore and snapped. She was arrested later that night after trying to break into a neighbor's house. As far as I know, she's still in jail. I always wondered why my parents got rid of the porch swing the next day and why they told the cops they hadn't seen her, even though they clearly had. I guess they didn't want anyone snooping around, especially with whatever illegal things they had going on. Life didn't really change after that. My parents didn't become more attentive, but I stopped staying up late. I never wanted to see anything like that again.